Kia ora all saints and welcome. I'm recording here from the Kakariki room, which used to be the meeting room, but we sort of don't use it for meetings, so we thought we'd rename it the Kakariki room, mainly because this lovely green colour behind me. Now we're 3 weeks into our Roman series and I hope you've been enjoying it so far. First off, I kicked it off talking about sin and this idea that all of us are sinful, including the Gentiles, which is part of Paul's argument. And then last week we had that wonderful service where Rebecca preached to us and talked to us about judgment and about this idea that we shouldn't judge one another. Now, up until now, it's been pretty dark and grim. Romans has been in this space and Paul is kind of arguing that all are guilty. First and foremost the Gentiles, and secondly the Jews. And today we conclude that argument and I'll show you how that happens. But first, if you haven't read the passage so far this week, jump into Romans chapter 3, start at verse 9, end at verse 26. We'll see you in a second. So hopefully by now all of you have read the passage. It's a pretty confusing passage. It has a lot of big words and lots of words that often you would find in a court kind of context. Righteousness, justification, redemption. Those sorts of words kind of roll around our justice system, don't they? Well, maybe not redemption so much, but the other two definitely. Verse 9 to verse 19 is basically the conclusion of Paul's argument. I've been talking already, it's been pretty grim rushing our way through Romans so far. We've talked about sin, we've talked about idolatry, we've talked about judgment. And the argument effectively from Paul is concluded in verse 9, where he says, all are guilty, all are guilty. It doesn't matter whether you are Gentile or Jew, all are under the power of sin. And so this concluding paragraph, this 9 to 19, helps us frame up where he goes to next. And the next part, 11 to 18, is just a heap of Old Testament passages quoted to us. Paul is using the argument that actually this is nothing new. Old Testament spoke about this idea for ages, that even the Jews were not blameless in what they did. It just furthers his point. All are guilty. All fall short. It doesn't matter whether you're a Jew. In fact, you had the law, so you are just as guilty, if not more guilty. You knew what was right, and you failed to fulfill that promise. I wonder how this sits with you. Because we sit in church sometimes as Christians, and I wonder whether we think we're better than others. We know the right way to live. We know Jesus, and therefore we are better. We live better lives. We're more holy than thou. We are people who follow God's rules. Are we better than others? Because this is kind of where the Jews were sitting. No, we had the law. We follow the law. This is, and Paul's argument is, it doesn't matter. In fact, the law only makes us conscious of sin. It doesn't work to make us right before God. No matter how hard you try, no matter how hard you work at being a good person, it doesn't fix the brokenness that sits between humanity and God. Now, this is kind of the conclusion to Paul's kind of argument in the first kind of half. We have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And then he starts a new part in verse 21. Now, I don't know if you were around in youth group when we did this, but I remember as a youth leader showing these videos in youth group. And this video would basically be like a small short clip showing a lead up to an event. And you don't really know what the event is going to be. And then it says what happens next. And you had to turn to your neighbour and you had to kind of discuss what's going to happen. What's the skateboarder that's rolling up to this ramp going to do? I wanted to show you one now just to kind of further my point. Here's a youth group video of what happens next. Now, I don't know how many of you got it. How many of you decided what happens next? How many of you figured it out? And often, these videos, they lean us with a surprise at the end. This is kind of what Paul is doing in verse 21. He starts this passage and he says, but now. It's almost like you're on the cliff of your seat. Okay, I get it, Paul. Everybody falls short. Everyone is guilty of sin. Everyone is trapped in that kind of power dynamic that happens there. All do sin, all have idols, all judge other people. And it's kind of like, okay, so what happens next, Paul? What's going to happen? And Paul says, but now. Now, remember this court kind of language, this kind of language that facilitates in this passage of righteousness, vindication, justification. Almost this point now, where Paul says, but now, it's like we're all lined up in the dock. All of humanity is in the courtroom. They're lined up in the guilty box, okay? And they're waiting there, waiting for this court, what's in session, what's going to happen. What's going to happen next? If God is truly God, how is he going to react? For instance, God called Israel to be the rescue vessel of humanity. In Genesis 3, we have Adam's sin, and in Genesis 12, Abraham is called out as an answer to fix Genesis 3. And so God calls these people together. He calls them and he says, you're my rescue plan. And he made promises to them. He said, your ancestors will number the skies. Okay, so the Jewish people grew. One, good. God is faithful to what he says. And then he makes promises to David. Your throne will reign forever. Ooh, now this is a bit of a dilemma. If all humanity has sinned and fallen short and turned away from God, how is God going to keep that promise while also recognizing that he can't keep people just turned away from him? God has to be faithful to what he promised, and he has to be faithful to his creation. He loves his creation. He wants them to thrive. He wants to rescue the world. How does he do that? He can't just do what he did once, which was bring a flood. Call one righteous family out and bring a flood for the rest. He tried that. It didn't work. And he promised never to do it again to Noah. So God has to think up a new way, a different way. God must be true to himself, and he must be true to the covenant that he made, the promises he made to his family, to his called special people that were meant to be his rescue plan. And how does he say, hey, you're meant to be my rescue plan, if he then doesn't follow through and make sure that the rescue plan happens? If you can kind of get your head around this, this is the dilemma God sits in. All are guilty, all are trapped, all humanity is trapped or like chained together, and God says, how do I free my people? That's what my heart yearns to do, and how do I keep my promises, and how do I make sure that what I've said is faithful? You've probably guessed the answer by now. And it's a very Sunday school answer, but ultimately Jesus is the answer to this. How does he become the answer to this? Well, he was born an Israelite. He was born into the family and the line of David. He fulfilled so many things that he becomes the representative of Israel. He becomes the true Israelite, in which fulfills God's plan and he saves the world. Israel were always meant to be a blessing, be blessed to be a blessing to others. They were always meant to think outside themselves and rescue the world and save the world. He called a people to show the world how to live, and they failed, just like the rest of us. And so God sends this true Israelite, this Jesus Messiah figure. He is the faithful Jewish Israelite who fulfilled Israel's calling and so declares the world can be made right again with God. Through his death, everything is brought to rightness. And this is effectively what verse 22, 23, and 24 are saying. Jesus is the faithful Messiah. He's the result of God's dilemma. And what does he offer? Redemption. Now, redemption is another court word, another justice word. It was used for freeing a slave. Effectively, Jesus is the freer of slaves, of his trapped people. That is the gospel. Now remember, as we work our way through Romans, we're going to hear the gospel again and again and again. But Jesus is the true Israelite, that God remains faithful to what he says. God continues to remain faithful to his promises. And God chooses to go after and rescue his people. And you know what we call this? Justification. We have been made right with God. We have got a new status, a new family, and a new future. And all we have to do is believe. So if you ever hear someone talking about justification by faith, you just have to believe that Jesus is this true Israelite Messiah, person who represents the Israelite people with their aim of rescuing the world. And if you do, you're given a new status. You're forgiven. If you do, you're given a new family, God's family. And if you do believe it, you're given a new future. But because your heart becomes transformed. Now I said there's a lot of legal kind of words through here, and one of the words that pops up in this passage again and again is the law. Paul says the law makes us conscious of our sin. It reveals to us, oh, okay, that wasn't the way God intended it to be. When we are transformed, when we're given a new future, the law becomes something we live into. Not because we're bound by it, but because we want to live the way God intended to us. If we truly believe we are redeemed, we are brought out of the trap and set free, just like the Israelites were under Egypt, then we should believe that the law is the best way to live. And this is why Paul finishes with the idea that actually we live into the law. We obey the law, not because it holds us, but because we believe that that is the best way to live. So my hope is that through this confusing passage, this passage with lots of word, you can see that Paul is concluding his argument here. He's setting us up for the rest of Romans. And he says, this is the gospel. Know the gospel. That all fall short of the glory of God. But Jesus is the answer. And he redeems us. He pulls us out of the snares and he says, you're free. And by that, we're given a new status. We're forgiven. And we should recognize that status. We should hold that status. Know that you are forgiven. Know that others are forgiven. We join a new family. We join God's family, the Christian church, the worldwide family of God. And we have a new future. Our heart is being transformed and continues to be transformed so that we can live in the way that Jesus promised and that is best for this world and to keep ourselves free. So in your small groups, in your house churches this week, I pray that you can have conversations around this. What does this mean for you? What is God saying to you? What are you going to do about it? Because it requires action. We can't just sit there and say we're forgiven. It requires us to transform our hearts and to learn again and again how to live His way. And by doing that, we join God's family. So let me pray. God, I'm just so thankful you did what you did through Jesus. I'm just so thankful that you are a faithful God who fulfills every promise that he gave. And I pray, Lord, that you, through us, would help to rescue the rest of the world. That we become the Israelite church that saves the rest of the world. We pray, Lord, for your people, that they would be transformed. And I pray, Lord, that they would understand the forgiveness they have received. You are the answer, Jesus. And we pray, Lord, that you would just renew our hearts, renew our minds, and renew our faith.